The funny thing about humiliation is that it usually looks harmless at first. By the time I realized I was being set up, my $45,000 tractor was already rolling down the street behind a pickup truck that didn't belong to me, and the man driving it wore the kind of smug grin you only see on someone who thinks nobody in the world is about to challenge him. He gave me a lazy little wave through his open window, like this was some kind of neighborhood misunderstanding, like I should be embarrassed for making a fuss. 10 minutes later, that grin was gone. I live on the edge of a semi-rural subdivision outside of Millbrook, the kind of place where new HOA developments keep pushing up against old properties like mine. On one side of the fence, there are matching mailboxes, approved paint palettes, and people who file formal complaints if a trash can is visible after sunset. On my side, there's a machine shed, 2 acres of rough field, and enough equipment to keep a small property functioning year-round. I've lived there for 11 years. The subdivision behind me has existed for 3. Ever since the HOA crowd moved in, there's been a low simmer of tension. Most of the neighbors keep to themselves, but there's always one person who treats a set of bylaws like royal blood. In our case, that person was Melissa Hargrove. Mid-50s, sharp haircut, permanent sunglasses, and a voice that always sounded like she was speaking to someone she'd already decided was beneath her. Around the neighborhood, people called her HOA Karen, never to her face, but absolutely with reason. Melissa had made it her personal mission to complain about my property from the moment she moved in. She didn't like the sound of my equipment in the morning. She didn't like the sight of my utility trailer. She once sent me a printed letter claiming my gravel turnaround was visually disruptive to community harmony, which is still one of the dumbest things I've ever read in my life. The problem for her was simple. I wasn't in her HOA. My land predated the development, and legally, she had no authority over what I parked, stored, or used on my own property. That truth seemed to eat at her. The tractor at the center of this mess was my John Deere 4066R with a front loader, back blade, and a few custom modifications I'd added over the years. It wasn't a toy, and it sure wasn't decorative. I used it constantly for grading the drive, clearing brush, moving feed, and maintaining drainage after heavy rain. Anyone with eyes could tell it was expensive, maintained, and privately owned. I kept it under a covered lean-to beside my shop, visible from the road if my gate was open. That Tuesday had started normally enough. I'd taken the morning off to handle some paperwork in town, then came back just before lunch because I needed a file from my office. I remember pulling into my driveway and immediately feeling that odd little hitch in my chest people get when something familiar is wrong. My gate was open wider than I'd left it. The chain was hanging loose. And down near the shed, I saw a dark blue pickup backed up to my trailer hitch assembly. At first, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then I noticed the flatbed trailer. Then I saw my tractor already strapped down on it. A man I recognized as Melissa's husband, Greg Hargrove, was checking one of the tie-downs like he was on a job site. Greg was a broad, red-faced guy who always carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in a way that mattered. He wasn't dressed like a thief. That's the part that almost makes it worse. He looked casual, comfortable, entitled. Like loading up another man's equipment in broad daylight was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. I got out of my truck and yelled, "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Greg turned slowly, not startled in the least. In fact, he looked annoyed that I'd interrupted him. Melissa was standing a few feet away near the fence line with her arms crossed, watching me with a tight smile that made my stomach turn. "We're removing an unauthorized nuisance vehicle," she said before Greg even opened his mouth. I actually laughed, because the statement was so absurd my mind rejected it on impact. "That's my tractor. On my property." Melissa lifted her chin. "Your property backs onto HOA view lots. We've had multiple complaints. This has been addressed repeatedly." "No," I said, walking closer. "You've complained repeatedly. That's not the same thing." Greg climbed into the pickup like he had already decided the discussion was over. "You can take it up with the board." Then he started the engine. I moved toward the trailer, but he inched the truck forward just enough to force me back unless I wanted to get dragged under the wheel well. It was the kind of calculated intimidation people use when they're betting the other person will blink first. Melissa folded her arms tighter, visibly enjoying herself. "You people don't seem to understand," she said. "Rules apply whether you cooperate or not." That was the moment the situation changed in my head. Until then, I'd been treating it like insanity, some bizarre HOA overreach that would collapse under its own stupidity. But as Greg pulled my tractor toward the road, I understood exactly what this was. It was theft, wrapped in suburban self-importance. And the most dangerous part was that they genuinely believed they had the right to do it. Greg gave me one last smirking glance through the driver's window as he rolled past the gate. That smirk lasted right up until I pulled out my wallet, flipped it open, and called in the theft using the badge I hadn't bothered showing either of them yet. People like Greg and Melissa always assume authority belongs to whoever speaks the loudest. I stood at the edge of my open gate, phone pressed to my ear, eyes fixed on the back of that trailer as it bounced down the road with my tractor chained to it like stolen livestock. My pulse was up, but my voice stayed level. Years on the job had burned one lesson deep into my bones. When other people start acting crazy, you get calmer, not louder. I gave dispatch my name, my badge number, my address, the plate on Greg's truck, and a clear, simple statement. Private property theft in progress, suspect known, vehicle currently heading east from my residence towing a flatbed with a John Deere tractor valued at $45,000. I could almost hear the shift in the dispatcher's tone when she recognized exactly who she was talking to. She asked if I was requesting local units or handling it personally. Local units, I said. I'm off duty, but I want this stopped now. Behind me, Melissa had lost some of her earlier confidence. She was still standing by the fence, but the smug posture had tightened around the shoulders. The moment people hear words like theft in progress and dispatch, reality starts tapping at the glass. You are being unbelievably dramatic, she snapped. This is an HOA enforcement matter. I turned and looked at her for a long second. Then you should have no problem explaining that to responding deputies. That landed. Her expression shifted, not into fear exactly, but into offense, the kind that comes from someone who has gone through life believing consequences are for other people. You cannot threaten residents for carrying out community standards. I'm not threatening anyone, I said. I'm reporting a felony. That word hit harder. Melissa opened her mouth, then shut it again. I saw the calculation behind her sunglasses. She was trying to decide whether doubling down would still work if uniforms were about to enter the conversation. People like her survive on confidence. Once confidence cracks, you start seeing the panic underneath. She took a step closer. No one stole anything. Greg is relocating that machinery pending review. It was in violation. From land you do not own, I said. It affects our neighborhood. It was parked on my property. It is visible from HOA homes. That, I said, is not a legal category. For the first time since I'd met Melissa Hargrove, she had no immediate comeback. A county patrol unit arrived fast, faster than she expected, judging by the slight backward shift in her stance when the cruiser pulled up in front of my gate. Deputy Aaron Pike stepped out first, then a second unit slid in behind him. I knew both deputies by face. Not close friends, but enough for professional familiarity. Aaron took one look at me, one look at Melissa, and understood this was not going to be a simple neighborhood spat about grass height. He walked over. You the reporting party? I am, I said, and handed him my ID wallet, open to the badge and credentials. Aaron nodded once and lowered his voice slightly. You okay? I'm fine. Tractor is gone. Husband took it 10 minutes ago with a trailer. Wife remained on scene. I want it documented clean. Understood. Melissa stepped forward before he could ask another question. Deputy, thank God. This man is escalating a board compliance issue and making false allegations. Aaron turned his head slowly toward her. Ma'am, I'll get your statement in a minute. Her lips tightened. She clearly wasn't used to being put on pause. I walked Aaron through everything from the open gate to Greg's exact words. I showed him where the chain had been moved, the drag marks from the trailer tires, and the security camera mounted on my shop corner. At that, Melissa's head snapped toward the camera so fast, it was almost comical. There's video? She asked. I didn't answer her. Aaron did. Good. We'll want that footage. That was when the color in her face changed. Not much. Just enough. Deputy Lena Morales stayed near the gate with Melissa while Aaron called in the truck description and requested intercept. Greg had taken the main road out, and there were only a few reasonable directions he could go while towing something that heavy. He wasn't going to disappear into the wilderness. Men like Greg never think past the first act. They mistake audacity for planning. Melissa tried one more angle. Surely this can be resolved civilly. There is no need to criminalize a misunderstanding. Aaron looked up from his radio. If someone enters private property and removes equipment without consent, that's already criminal, ma'am. The silence that followed was the first honest silence she had offered all day. Then Aaron's radio crackled. A unit had eyes on Greg's truck 2 miles east, pulled over near the old feed store. And suddenly, for the first time, Melissa looked exactly like a woman realizing the rules she liked to weaponize were not actually hers to control. Nothing exposes fake power faster than real power showing up uninvited. Aaron asked if I wanted to ride with them to the traffic stop or follow in my own truck. I chose to follow. Part of that was practical. I needed my vehicle anyway if the tractor was being returned, but part of it was something else. I wanted to see Greg Hargrove's face when the story in his head collapsed. I wanted to watch the exact moment he realized this wasn't some harmless HOA stunt he could bluff his way through. Melissa asked if she could come explain the misunderstanding. Aaron didn't even look at her when he answered. You can remain here, or you can drive yourself, but if you interfere with the stop, you'll create a new problem. That shut her up for almost 30 seconds, which I believe was a personal record. By the time I reached the shoulder near the old feed store, 2 county units had Greg boxed in from front and rear. His pickup sat crooked off the road, trailer still attached, my tractor still strapped down exactly as he'd taken it. Deputy Mills was at the driver's window. Another deputy stood near the trailer, one hand resting casually near his belt, not aggressive, just making it very clear this was not a debate club. Greg was already outside the truck when I pulled over. His expression had changed so dramatically it almost would have been funny under different circumstances. The smirk was gone. In its place was that strange mix of irritation and disbelief people wear when they think rules are malfunctioning around them. He saw me step out and immediately raised his voice. There he is. Tell them this is just an HOA issue. I walked up beside Aaron and said nothing for a moment. Silence, used properly, can do more work than shouting ever will. Greg looked from me to Aaron, then back again. We were moving it. Temporarily. The board has had multiple complaints. Aaron's tone stayed flat. Do you own the tractor? No. Do you own the land it was taken from? No. But, did you have permission from the owner? Greg paused just long enough to answer the question without speaking. Aaron nodded once. Okay. That one word hit him harder than an argument would have. Melissa arrived 2 minutes later in her SUV, pulled too far onto the gravel shoulder, and hurried over in oversized sunglasses and self-righteous panic. She started talking before her door was fully shut. This has gotten ridiculous. We are representatives of the neighborhood, and this equipment was depreciating property values. Deputy Mills held up a hand. Ma'am, stop talking for a second. The fact that someone had actually said that to Melissa Hargrove in public may have been the first truly satisfying moment of my afternoon. She stopped, though not willingly. Aaron gestured toward me. For clarity, the property owner is also law enforcement. Greg blinked. What? I reached into my back pocket, flipped open my credentials again, and let him see the badge clearly this time. County investigator, I said. Off duty today. Still very capable of recognizing theft. I have rarely seen a human face lose color so quickly. He looked at Melissa then, and that look told me more than words could have. He had gone along with her version of events because he believed there would be no real pushback. Maybe he thought I was just some rural homeowner she had been bullying for months. Maybe he assumed that if she said HOA enough times, reality would rearrange itself around her confidence. Instead, he had loaded stolen property in broad daylight under security cameras and then driven it down a public road. Melissa tried to recover first. No one knew you were a police officer. I looked at her. That's your defense. She faltered. I mean, if we had understood, no, I said. If you had understood there would be consequences, you wouldn't have done it. That landed exactly where it needed to. Aaron asked Greg to place his hands behind his back. Greg jerked his head back. Are you serious? You entered private property and removed equipment valued at $45,000 without permission, Aaron said. Yes, I'm serious. Melissa stepped forward. This is outrageous. We were enforcing standards. Deputy Mills turned to her. Do HOA standards include trespassing and theft now? She opened her mouth and found nothing waiting there. As Aaron secured Greg in cuffs, every trace of bravado drained out of him. He wasn't angry anymore. Angry requires a sense of leverage. What he looked instead was embarrassed, cornered, and suddenly very aware that the side of the road is a terrible place to discover your wife's confidence, has written a check your judgment can't cash. I stood by the trailer and ran a hand over the tractor's fender, checking for damage while the deputies finished their work. One of the straps had rubbed the paint, but otherwise it looked intact. Then I heard Melissa say the one sentence that told me she still had not fully grasped the scale of her mistake. "Can't we settle this as neighbors?" I turned and looked at her. "No," I said. "That option left with my tractor." The people who shout loudest about respect usually mean obedience. Once Greg was in the back of the patrol car, the whole performance collapsed faster than I expected. For all the noise Melissa had made about standards, boards, and community authority, she looked strangely small standing on the shoulder of that road with 18-wheelers growling past and 2 deputies ignoring her outrage on principle. There's something about flashing lights and handcuffs that strips the fantasy out of people. Suddenly there are no committees, no email chains, no passive-aggressive violation notices. There are just facts. And the facts were ugly. Aaron had one of the deputies photograph the trailer, the truck, the tractor, and the straps exactly as they were. He asked me to email over the camera footage as soon as I got back home, along with purchase documentation for the tractor and any previous written contact I'd had with Melissa or the HOA. That last part mattered more than most people realize. Crazy behavior is one thing. A documented pattern turns crazy into intent. I had plenty of documentation. Over the last 2 years, Melissa had sent me 7 letters, 3 printed notices, and more emails than I cared to count. Most were dressed up in formal language, but the message was always the same. She wanted my property to conform to the visual preferences of a neighborhood I did not belong to. She had demanded I move my utility trailer, screen my equipment, limit my mowing hours, repaint my shed, and once. This one still amazes me. Consider replacing gravel surfaces with a more aesthetically cohesive treatment. That treatment, as near as I could tell, was grass, which would have turned my turnaround into mud every time it rained. Each time, I responded politely and in writing. I explained that my property was outside HOA authority. I cited county parcel maps. I attached legal descriptions. Once, after she threatened escalation, I had my attorney send a clean little letter reminding the board that any attempt to enter my land or interfere with my equipment would result in immediate legal action. So when Aaron asked whether there had been prior conflict, I almost laughed. "Enough to fill a binder," I told him. Melissa heard that and snapped. "Because you refused to cooperate with reasonable community expectations." Aaron didn't even turn around. "Ma'am, every time you speak right now, you make this worse." Again, silence. Not chosen. Imposed. Greg, meanwhile, had reached the stage where indignation starts curdling into self-preservation. Through the patrol car window, I could see him leaning toward Aaron whenever the door opened, trying to explain that he had only done what the board wanted, that Melissa handled all the compliance stuff, that no one intended to steal anything permanently. It was the classic retreat from aggression into technicality. We didn't steal it, we relocated it. We didn't trespass, we entered for enforcement. We didn't mean harm, we just took what wasn't ours. Intent matters in court. So do actions. And actions were not on Greg's side. The county tow contractor was called out, but in the end it was simpler for me to bring my own truck around and recover the trailer after deputies finished processing the scene. They released the tractor back to me there on site once photographs were done. Watching the straps come off was oddly satisfying, like undoing a bad sentence one buckle at a time. Melissa hovered near the edge of the gravel shoulder, still trying to catch someone's eye, still waiting for a moment when personality could overpower procedure. It never came. Nobody cared how important she felt in her subdivision newsletter. Out here, she was just a woman attached to a criminal complaint. Before Aaron left, he stepped aside with me near my tailgate. Between the footage, the property history, and them admitting they moved it, "This is clean," he said. "You want to push this all the way?" I looked over at Greg in cuffs, and Melissa standing rigid beside her SUV. "Yes," I said. "All the way." He nodded once, like he'd expected that answer. On the drive back, towing my own tractor home, I had too much adrenaline left to feel tired. What I felt instead was something colder. Not rage exactly. Clarity. Melissa had not made a stupid mistake in the moment. This was the logical endpoint of years of entitlement. She had tested boundaries over and over, and because nobody had forced consequences on her before, She had mistaken that for permission. When I turned back onto my road, I noticed something else. People were outside. A lot of people. Front porches, driveways, sidewalks along the subdivision entrance. Word had clearly traveled fast. Patrol cars do that to a neighborhood. So does seeing the HOA president's husband brought back behind flashing lights. And judging by the expressions on those faces, this story was only getting started. You told us he was violating easements. Then another. You said there were legal notices. Melissa looked around as if betrayal had erupted from the mulch. They were concerns raised by residents, she snapped. No, Diane said. They were your personal obsession. I stayed quiet. Sometimes the best thing you can do is stop talking and let truth arrive from a source the bully can't dismiss as the enemy. And truth was arriving in layers. Within minutes, 3 more neighbors had drifted close enough to stop pretending. One said Melissa had circulated emails implying my property lowered everyone's home values. Another said Greg had bragged at a cookout that if the county wouldn't do its job, the board might handle things privately. That line lodged in my mind immediately, not because it surprised me, but because it would sound very interesting in a formal statement. Melissa realized too late that she was no longer managing a narrative. She was standing in the middle of its collapse. You are all being manipulated, she said, but even she didn't sound convinced. Diane folded her arms. No, Melissa, we're just finally watching the consequences you always assumed someone else would absorb. And for the first time since this started, I saw something more fragile than anger pass across Melissa's face. Fear. Not of me. Not even of the police. Fear of losing the one thing people like her value most. Control. The moment a bully loses the crowd, they start searching for a victim to blame. Melissa stood there at the fence with that brittle, overtight posture people get when they can feel authority slipping out of their hands in public. The neighbors weren't yelling. They didn't need to. Calm disappointment can be far more dangerous to a person like her than open conflict. Anger gives someone like Melissa something to fight. Collective clarity leaves nowhere to hide. She looked from face to face, trying to decide who had become disloyal first. This is exactly the kind of chaos I've been trying to prevent, she said, voice sharp with strain. People stop respecting standards, and everything falls apart. Diane gave a short, humorless laugh. You had someone arrested over a tractor parked on land you don't own. It affected the neighborhood. No, Diane said. Your need to control people affected the neighborhood. That one landed hard enough that Melissa physically recoiled. I could have stepped in then. I could have added details, corrected timelines, reinforced every point with documentation. But I didn't. There is a special kind of justice in watching a manipulator face people she can't dismiss as outsiders. To Melissa, I had always been easy to label. The difficult neighbor, the non-compliant property owner, the obstacle. But these were her own residents. Her own audience. The same people she had spent years trying to manage through pressure, selective information, and tone. And now they were comparing notes. A younger man near the corner lot, late 30s, polo shirt, holding a half-watered hanging basket like he had come outside in the middle of a chore and simply never gone back in, spoke up next. Didn't you also tell us the county was going to cite him if he didn't move the equipment? Melissa turned too quickly. That was based on what I had been told. By who, he asked. She hesitated. That was all anyone needed. Because the truth about people who bluff with authority is simple. The bluff only works as long as no one asks for names, dates, or paperwork. Diane looked over at me. Did the county ever cite you? Not once, I said. Did the HOA ever have any legal right to your land? No, a woman from 2 houses down frowned. Then why were we told legal action was already in motion? Melissa snapped back. Because we were exploring options. No, I said evenly. You were manufacturing pressure. Every eye shifted to her. That was the moment she made the mistake that told me she still didn't understand the room. Instead of backing off, instead of saying nothing, she did what controlling people always do under stress. She escalated. Well, maybe if you had behaved like a decent neighbor from the beginning, she said to me, none of this would have happened. There it was. The final refuge of the unreasonable. If you had just submitted, I wouldn't have had to hurt you. The silence after that was deep and total. Then Diane said, very quietly, that sounds an awful lot like a threat. Melissa's expression flickered. That is not what I meant. It's what you said, the younger man replied. She looked around again, this time visibly searching for someone, anyone to align with her. No one moved. No one nodded. Nobody offered the rescue she expected. The social gravity had shifted, and she could feel it. I opened the side door of my shop and set my folder on the workbench just inside. Years of dealing with nonsense had taught me one useful habit: save everything. Printed letters, HOA notices, emails, certified mail receipts, photos. I came back out carrying the thick binder and held it up just enough for the neighbors to see. This, I said, is 2 years of her complaints, demands, false claims, and attempts to pressure me into surrendering property rights she never had. Diane's eyes widened. You kept all of it? I was hoping I'd never need it, I said, but I'm glad I did. Melissa took a step back from the fence. Not dramatic, just involuntary. A county vehicle rolled slowly onto the street at that exact moment. Not lights on this time, just a plain supervisory SUV. Sergeant Wilkes stepped out with a clipboard and the kind of expression supervisors wear when they're arriving at a scene that has already become paperwork with a pulse. I need supplemental statements from anyone who directly heard prior threats, saw today's removal, or received board communications about this property, he said. 3 hands went up almost immediately. Then 5. Melissa's face emptied. And in that instant, standing there in front of her own neighborhood, she finally realized this was no longer about one stolen tractor. It was about a pattern, and patterns are a lot harder to smirk your way out of. When people start volunteering evidence against their own leadership, you know the collapse was overdue. Sergeant Wilkes didn't raise his voice, didn't posture, didn't do anything dramatic. He simply stood near the edge of my driveway with a clipboard, a neutral expression, and the quiet competence of a man who had spent enough years in law enforcement to recognize the smell of a situation that had been rotting long before patrol cars arrived. That calm was more effective than shouting ever could have been. It made the moment feel official in a way Melissa couldn't interrupt. Neighbors began stepping forward one by one. Not all at once. That would have been emotional. This was worse for her. This was deliberate. Diane gave the first statement. She described board meetings where Melissa had repeatedly referred to my property as an unresolved visual blight and claimed county enforcement was imminent. She said she had argued more than once that my land was outside HOA jurisdiction and had been ignored each time. She also remembered Greg joking at a summer cookout that if the old guy with the tractor won't move it, maybe we'll move it for him. I'm not old, for the record, but I let that part go. The man with the hanging basket, his name turned out to be Trevor, said Melissa had sent a neighborhood email 3 months earlier implying that legal notices had already been served against me. Another resident said board members had discussed corrective action in language vague enough to sound official and specific enough to sound threatening. Someone else mentioned being pressured to sign a petition about my equipment storage violations, even after asking whether my property was actually under HOA control. Every new detail tightened the net. Melissa tried twice to interrupt and got shut down both times. The first time, Sergeant Wilkes simply lifted one hand and said, "Ma'am, you'll have your chance." The second time, Diane turned to her and said, "No, actually, you've had your chance for 3 years." That one hit harder. I stayed near the shop with the binder open on the tailgate of my truck, pulling documents as needed. Certified letters, printouts of emails, parcel maps, the attorney notice I'd sent after her last round of escalation. Wilkes reviewed each item with the expression of a man watching puzzle pieces snap together much faster than expected. "You sent this to the board?" he asked, holding up the attorney letter. "I did. And they acknowledged receipt?" I handed him the signed certified mail slip. He looked at it, then at Melissa. The distance between those two looks could have swallowed a career. For the first time all evening, Melissa didn't argue. She just stared at the green receipt card in his hand, like maybe paperwork itself had betrayed her. People who rely on intimidation often forget that documentation is its natural predator. A little after 6, one of the other board members arrived. His name was Leonard Shaw, though I only knew that because I'd seen his signature on one of the more ridiculous violation notices. He pulled up in a silver sedan, stepped out, took one look at the county vehicles, the cluster of neighbors, Melissa's face, and my binder, and immediately developed the expression of a man who regrets every decision that led him to this driveway. "Melissa," he said carefully, "what is going on?" Before she could answer, Diane did. "Your president had Greg steal his tractor." Leonard visibly flinched. I'm sorry, what? Wilkes introduced himself and asked if Leonard was currently serving on the HOA board. Leonard confirmed he was treasurer. Then came the question that changed his entire posture. Did the board formally authorize removal of private property from land outside HOA jurisdiction? Leonard answered too quickly. Absolutely not. Melissa turned on him. We discussed enforcement options. No, Leonard said, and I could hear genuine panic entering his voice now. We discussed sending another letter. You supported action. I supported legal review. Those two words, legal review, hung in the air like a brick dropped into still water, because everyone present understood the difference. One is consultation. The other is theft with a committee excuse. Wilkes asked Leonard whether any vote had been taken, any attorney consulted, or any written directive issued permitting entry onto my property. Leonard said no to all three. He looked pale by the end of it. Melissa's mouth opened, then closed. The script was gone now. She could no longer hide behind the board because the board, or at least part of it, had just stepped out from behind her. And once that happened, the final illusion shattered. She had never been enforcing community standards. She had been freelancing power. As dusk started creeping over the road and porch lights began flicking on up and down the subdivision, Sergeant Wilkes closed his clipboard and said the words I think Melissa had feared all along. Based on the statements and documentation so far, this is expanding beyond a single incident. You could have heard a pin drop. Then he added, and I strongly suggest everyone involved start preserving every email from that board. The most dangerous sentence in a collapsing cover-up is, preserve every email. You could actually feel the neighborhood shift when Sergeant Wilkes said it. Until then, some of the residents had still been treating the whole thing like an outrageous local scandal, the kind of story people whisper about over fences and then retell for years at cookouts. But preserve every email changed the tone. That phrase belongs to a different universe. Not gossip, not drama, evidence. Leonard understood it immediately. His hand went to the side of his neck, rubbing the skin there the way people do when stress starts moving physical. Sergeant, he said carefully, are you saying the board may be implicated? Wilkes gave him the kind of answer only experienced supervisors know how to give. Measured, accurate, and quietly terrifying. I'm saying if board communications contain false representations, directives to trespass, coordination regarding removal of private property, or efforts to pressure witnesses after the fact, those records matter. Leonard went another shade paler. Melissa tried to recover. This is absurd. The board acted in good faith. No, I said, you acted in confidence. That's not the same thing. She shot me a look sharp enough to cut wire, but there wasn't much force behind it anymore. Anger loses its shape when it keeps colliding with documents. Wilkes turned to Leonard. Do you have access to board emails? Yes. Meeting minutes? Yes. Resident complaints related to this property? He hesitated. Probably. That one word told me more than the rest. Probably meant there were records scattered across private inboxes, forwarded chains, personal phones, maybe even deleted messages somebody assumed no one would ever ask for. Small organizations get sloppy when they think nobody serious is watching. They confuse amateur structure with invisibility. Do not delete anything, Wilkes said. Do not advise anyone else to delete anything. If records exist, they remain preserved. Leonard nodded quickly. Melissa folded her arms. You're making this sound criminal. Wilkes looked at her without expression. Entering private land and removing equipment without consent is criminal. Anything surrounding the planning or misrepresentation may also become relevant. There it was, stripped clean. A teenage kid across the street, clearly pretending to help his dad drag in trash bins while actually listening to every word, almost dropped a lid. His father gave up the act entirely and just stood there. Diane stepped closer to Leonard. Did you know she told people county action was imminent? Leonard looked genuinely shaken. No, she did, Trevor said. More than once. And legal notices had already been served, another neighbor added. Leonard turned to Melissa. Did you say that? She lifted her chin. I said we were moving toward formal remedies. That is not what people are saying they heard. The way he said it told me he was already starting to separate himself from her in his own mind. Publicly, strategically, self-preservation was waking up. I'd seen that before. In investigations, there comes a moment when participants stop being a united front and start calculating individual survivability. Once that happens, the structure usually breaks fast. I went into the shop, grabbed my laptop, and came back out to the driveway workbench where the Wi-Fi still reached if I angled the screen right. I can send the camera footage now, I told Wilkes. He nodded. Do it. Melissa turned so sharply I thought for a second she might actually lose balance. You're really going to circulate that? It's evidence, I said. It will destroy Greg. No, I said, clicking attach. Greg did that when he hooked up my trailer. That shut her down again. The footage uploaded in 2 clips. One wide-angle shot showing Greg backing in through my open gate, while Melissa stood near the fence, and another clearer segment from the side camera, catching him fastening the straps, and both of them speaking for nearly 2 minutes before he pulled out. No audio worth much, but visually it was excellent. Deliberate, calm, coordinated. Not confusion, not accident. Planning. When the files finished sending, Wilkes confirmed receipt on his phone. That helps. Leonard exhaled through his nose, long and slow, like a man hearing a door lock somewhere behind him. Then his own phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and I watched his expression change. What? Diane asked. Leonard looked up slowly. It's Sandra, board secretary. Yeah. She says Melissa just logged into the board account remotely and started deleting threads. For half a second, nobody moved. Then Wilkes held out his hand. Mr. Shaw, he said, very calmly. I'm going to need that phone. And Melissa, who had spent all day acting like the smartest person in the neighborhood, suddenly looked like someone who had just made the dumbest mistake of her life. Panic makes arrogant people do in minutes what patience never could have proven in months. The silence after Leonard read that message lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it felt longer. That's the thing about a moment when everyone understands, all at once, that a bad situation has just become a much worse one. Time stretches, breathing changes, faces harden, and somewhere inside the person who caused it, the first real crack opens. Wilkes took Leonard's phone, read the message himself, then looked up at Melissa. Did you access the board account just now? Her answer came too fast. No, that was strike one. Because Leonard's phone buzzed again almost immediately, this time with a screenshot from Sandra. A web login notification. Melissa's name. Timestamped less than 3 minutes earlier. Wilkes did not raise his voice. Ma'am, I'm going to ask again. Melissa's posture shifted. Not surrender. Recalculation. I logged in to review communications, she said carefully. Did you delete anything? No, strike two. Leonard, still staring at the incoming messages on his phone, swallowed hard. Sandra says threads are disappearing. Melissa snapped toward him. Then Sandra is mistaken. Nobody believed that. Not even her. Judging by the way she suddenly stopped making eye contact and started scanning the crowd instead, as if searching for escape routes through human reactions. Wilkes handed Leonard's phone back, but kept his own out. Do you have the board account on your personal device? Melissa hesitated. That was enough. Ma'am, he said, if evidence is being altered after preservation instructions were given, that creates a separate issue. I saw the exact instant those words reached her. Evidence. Altered. Separate issue. Up until then, she had still been fighting the original fire. Now she understood she might have poured gasoline on a second one. This is unbelievable, she said, but the force was gone. You're twisting normal administrative actions into something sinister. Trevor muttered, not quite under his breath. Deleting emails after a cop tells you not to is pretty sinister. A few people nodded. Diane didn't even bother pretending diplomacy anymore. Melissa stopped talking. That one actually startled me a little. Not because of the words, but because of the tone. It wasn't angry. It was exhausted. Deeply, completely exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that comes from years of watching someone push too far and finally seeing the bill arrive. Wilkes asked Leonard if the board account had administrator logs. Leonard said yes, probably through the hosting provider. Sandra, still texting updates, had apparently already frozen her own access and was trying to contact the company to preserve server records. That was smarter than I expected from an HOA secretary, and I made a mental note that not everyone on that board had been asleep. Melissa heard that and took a half step forward. Sandra has no authority to freeze anything without my approval. Wilkes looked at her. That is no longer your biggest concern. The neighbors had gone very still by then. No side conversations. No fake errands. No shifting around for better views. Just stillness. People were watching the collapse of someone who had spent years behaving as if she was untouchable, and no one wanted to miss the part where reality finally touched back. I checked my phone and saw Aaron had sent a brief update. Greg had been booked, processed, and was now asking for an attorney. Smartest thing he'd done all day. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because the more this unfolded, the clearer it became that Greg had not simply been dragged along by his wife's obsession. He had backed the truck in, loaded the tractor, tightened the straps, and driven off while smirking at me through the window. Whatever influence Melissa had, he had still chosen action. Adults do not become innocent because they were confidently stupid. Wilkes asked Melissa one final time whether she would voluntarily surrender the device she had used to access the board account. She crossed her arms tighter. Am I being accused of something? That depends partly on what happens in the next few minutes. I want a lawyer. There it was. Not outrage. Not explanation. Lawyer. The word spread through the crowd like a cold draft. Wilkes nodded once. That is your right. Leonard closed his eyes briefly, then said, almost to himself, my God. Diane looked at me across the driveway. Did she really think she could just bully this forever? Yes, I said. That's exactly what she thought. And maybe that was the heart of it. People like Melissa live inside a private math where pressure always works, records can always be shaped, and the truth can always be delayed long enough to become irrelevant. But that only works until one person keeps receipts, stays calm, and refuses to be shoved into the role they were assigned. A second county supervisor vehicle turned onto the street just as porch lights fully took over from daylight. Wilkes saw it, then looked back at Melissa. Stand by, ma'am, he said. And for the first time all day, she did exactly as she was told.